Hello everyone, welcome to Theory of Architecture. My guest today is Cleo Valentine. She is a systems designer, neuroarchitectural researcher and doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge Department of Architecture. She is also currently an associate at Cambridge Architectural Research, where she provides consultancy services on public health and architecture. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed this one. We really got into the depths of the subject. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. I hope it's a topic that you can think more about as people within the architectural world or people just interested in architecture. And please do leave us a review, especially on Apple and Spotify as well, and follow the YouTube channel. It really helps us out. I want to grow this channel a bit more and get a bit more content coming in more regularly as well. And to do that, the more reviews, the more feedback, the more recommendations I have, the better. Thank you everyone, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Cleo Valentine, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, tell us a little bit about what your background is and how you got to be doing what you're doing currently, and then what exactly that is.
Okay, yeah, so my background's really in kind of architectural theory and urban systems. Urban systems being kind of a branch off of like urban studies, I suppose, but it's a very Canadian thing. It's a program that they have in McGill, which is in Montreal. And it's kind of the intersection of architecture with sociology, economics, criminology. It could be kind of biology or evolutionary biology. And it's trying to kind of bring in this really interdisciplinary approach to the built environment. So not necessarily just architecture or buildings specifically, but also the way cities develop over time. It's almost a human geography degree, but with a very kind of built environment focus. And while I was at McGill, I ended up going to University of Copenhagen, primarily because of Gale Architects. I saw their documentary and I just thought that the kind of human-based approach or kind of observational-based approach to urban design, particularly with all of the UN statistics about kind of increasing urbanization, seemed really interesting. That kind of led to my research, which was at Oxford, my MSc, which was in kind of urban development or sustainable urban development, but they kind of gave me a bit of free rein. And so I ended up doing a research project on architectural neuroaesthetics and public health. And this idea that I had that there was this physiological inclination to beauty that might be representative of some benefit to our physical health. So I ended up developing a machine learning algorithm to try and assess architectural facades and then cross-reference those geospatially located images of buildings with public health census data, and trying to see if actually there were some trends in the types of buildings that are in people's radius or kind of the average distance that most people spend the majority of their time. Is there some relationship on a large scale, like on a public health scale that's measurable and quantifiable? Is there some kind of measurable benefit in health? And there was. I mean, it's a study that certainly could use more kind of fortification, and it was an exploratory activity, but it indicated something, and I desperately wanted to know what that something was. You know, I really loved the idea that in this instance, it was kind of beauty or neuroaesthetics or a physiological response to the built environment and our inclinations had this impact on our physiology, but I really wanted to understand what that physiological response was. So that really led me to my research now, which is on what I'm kind of calling architectural neuroimmunology, which is really the study of how buildings or architectural form. I'm primarily interested in the kind of visual exposure of architecture. There are other people who are kind of more interested in, auditory or thermal comfort, which are all very important as well. But I'm particularly interested in visual exposure to architectural form. So the kind of geometric configuration of buildings and urban forms and how that impacts the brain via the immune system. So I'm particularly interested in neuroinflammation, which is inflammation of the brain, which is a kind of immune-mediated response to various different environmental triggers. It could be bacterial or viral, some microbial, but it could also be autoimmune, but it can also be environmental. And that could be environmental toxins. It can be all kinds of different things. But my kind of working theory right now is that visual exposure to architectural design may mediate these inflammatory responses. And we know that neuroinflammation, the rates of neuroinflammation are increasing, and neuroinflammation is one of the primary drivers in a lot of neurodegenerative conditions like dementia, but also psychiatric conditions. So, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and those are particularly prevalent and increasing in their prevalence in urban environments. So that's the research that I'm doing right now, which is my doctoral research, and that's at Cambridge.
I think you're right to say that it's rare to be actually directly assessing the aesthetic side of architecture rather than lots of other stuff, because I found plenty of research on, as you say, like thermal comfort and sort of even things like wayfinding and stuff like that, and color palettes and contrasting in relation to that sort of thing, but actually assessing the pure aesthetics. And can I say, you mentioned the B word first, beauty. We'll get onto that. I think it's great that you're doing that kind of research. I think there needs to be a lot more of that. So obviously you're quite early on in a lot of the research you're doing, and the classic response to any study is more research is needed. What findings have you sort of begun to see in what you've done so far?
Yeah. So when I was kind of getting into the neuroaesthetics world, which I'm still in, but less so in the kind of traditional sense. But the thing that kept coming back to me was this biophilic design. And I really kind of traced it back. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Nico Salangaro's work, and I feel like it's really revolutionary. And I love the kind of mathematic complexity and kind of analytical side of that. But I also got really interested in something called constructal law. Have you heard of it?
No, what's that?
Okay, so constructal law is a kind of fundamental physics principle, and I probably won't describe it super well, but it's defined by this guy, Adrian Bijan, who's at Duke. So from what I understand, he is an engineer by training, and he became really interested in kind of energy flows and efficiency. And he kind of kept coming to the same conclusion that the most efficient distribution of energy always ended up being this kind of fractalized biomorphic form that was repeating throughout nature. And that it wasn't a fluke, it wasn't some, kind of just a happy accident that we see these patterns repeating in so many different ways, but it's actually derived from very fundamental physics principles that are kind of determined by, the thermodynamic systems on Earth, planetary, all of these different driving forces. And I thought that was really interesting. So I was like, okay, that really drives a lot of the biophilic design. And it also explains to an extent why biophilic design isn't just the incorporation of organic material. It's so much more than that. And it can be the incorporation of these kind of geometric forms into architectural design, or it can be the mimicry of them, like, Corinthian columns. It can be all kinds of different things, which I also feel is very freeing for architects, because it doesn't necessarily mean that there's this prescriptive, you have to do it this way. It's these kind of principles that you can incorporate however you like. But I kind of took that biophilic thread and I'm trying to kind of pull it through into this neuroinflammatory or neuroimmunology research. So my first pilot study was really on, can visual exposure to biophilic architectural designs, which you have to kind of define quite clearly in this context, downregulate neuroinflammatory responses? So can it reduce neuroinflammation? And preliminary study, pilot study, but encouraging, and the results suggested that potentially it does. And so the research that I'm kind of working on now is really, can the lack of certain architectural forms, and again, it needs to be defined very clearly, but are there certain ways that we design that increase neuroinflammatory activity without us really knowing it? Kind of seemingly benign forms that we incorporate into architecture all the time that aren't necessarily biophilic. And how does that increase inflammation, or does it increase inflammation in the brain? So that's sort of what I'm working with. And a lot of it is dealing with the methodological limitations of architectural science or applied architectural science. How do you identify specific deviations in architectural form? How do you manipulate them? How do you test them? So it's a work in progress for sure.
Yeah, well, there's so many.
More research is needed. More research is
more
needed.
research is always needed. There's so many confounding variables, isn't it? That's the trouble. It's so hard to define exactly what it is that you're measuring and control for everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot. I do think that some of the kind of technological innovations that we have are making it easier. again, you always have to state, and I try and state it very clearly and at the beginning, that there are so many limitations to this research, but the only way we move through limitations is to conduct research and try to do it better and better and better each time. But there are a lot of confounding variables. The kind of VR, AR side of things is really interesting, especially the more realistic it gets. That being said, I just published a paper on kind of some of the neurophysiological health concerns of virtual architecture and how we need to be careful when it comes to constructing these kind of virtual worlds, particularly because they don't necessarily adhere to the same fundamental laws of physics. So we don't necessarily have the same constraints on gravity, things like that. But there are a lot. So it's really trying to kind of peel that back. And I feel like that's where neuroarchitecture or architectural health has always tried to kind of develop through or move beyond. But
Yeah.
working.
Well, you're not even there's been a lot of research that does, well, some research that does rely on sort of self-reported inputs and factors related to, I don't know, happiness and like self-reported variables, and then relating that to architecture. But you are actually looking directly at the actual neurological responses, which is, I think, the sort of the real fundamental proper science, if you like, of it, which is
the crazy thing to me is that it's not always the same. You know, that's the thing that kind of comes up in the neuroaesthetics research. What we think we like, or consciously what we incline towards, and what we physiologically positively respond to are not always the same thing. So the kind of self-reporting has so much value in terms of kind of understanding our conscious preferences and all of this. But our physiological response, it's a whole other world. It's a whole other world that's going on in our physiology that we're not really super aware of.
Yeah, you can't lie with your physiological responses, can you? That's the trouble.
No, you cannot.
Yeah, so you've done some research using VR, is that right? Using like creating environments to sort of study how people are responding in the VR settings.
Well, that's kind of the emerging research that I'm working on right now and kind of defining it right now, is trying to understand what are the limitations of using VR. I mean, one of the kind of interesting principles is actually, you know, even showing someone a 2D image of an architectural form seems to tell us something. It doesn't tell us everything, but it tells us something. And I guess that's kind of the biomimicry side of things. This idea that, you know, if you show someone, if you put a fake plant in a room, there'll be similar physiological responses if it's compelling. You know, if you show someone a photo, there'll be similar responses, which opens up a lot of opportunity in terms of kind of the ways in which we can do research. But yeah, going forwards, I think VR will be a really critical tool. And so what I'm working on is trying to figure out how best to construct those experiments.
Yeah, well, experimental design is a sort of art in itself, isn't it? To be able to get it right and not have it torn to pieces in peer review.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and can I say I am also a massive advocate of fake plants for exactly that reason.
Me too.
Zero maintenance, maximum psychological benefit.
You know, and less bugs. I'm not a fan
Fewer
of bugs.
That is true. That's true. Although you do get a sort of wholesomeness from having to look after a plant and keep it alive if it's a real one.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I have a dog for that, and she, you know, she'll like actually tell me if I'm not doing a good job. Whereas my plants are less communicative. But yes, absolutely, I do think there's something very well. And actually, I was talking to somebody the other day who's working on kind of neuroendocrine responses to organic material. So there's actually probably some physiological benefits that come from kind of this neuroendocrine modulation. It's kind of the idea behind the Japanese forest bathing stuff. This idea that physically being around plants helps or regulates or impacts our kind of neuroendocrine responses, which is super interesting. And I guess air quality. So there are so many things, but I am still an advocate of fake plants when needs must.
Yeah, well, as that's sort of the one-dimensional side of biophilic design or biointegration is that, like, put plants on stuff, basically. Green roofs, green walls, etc., put plants around things. Like, yes, obviously. The more detailed, the more in-depth sort of second dimension of it, which you mentioned earlier, is that sort of biological form within architectural form itself. And whether that's what people think of classically as biological forms, like all wavy curves and stuff growing out of stuff, which looks sort of organicist, I suppose you might call it, versus, as you say, the sort of fractal dimension, which might not necessarily look biological, whether it's just highly ornamented or it's got structural order or it's got the right scaling ratios and all this kind of thing. that for me is where the key is in terms of,
too.
it's not that it's biological that makes it, well, the hypothesis is, it's not that it's biological that makes it valuable, it's that it shares the qualities that biological things also share. And
Yeah.
those things are valued by our brains and have certain responses, and therefore architecture that
Mm-hmm.
has those qualities induces the same responses.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And so the trick there for me right now is, how do you define them? How do you measure them? And how do you make sure that it's not necessarily this subjective measurement that can kind of be, and it kind of can kind of undermine the experimental design or the rigor of the experimental design. But it's a difficult thing to do. In terms of kind of the technological innovations, I do actually think that kind of image analysis or machine learning image analysis can offer a lot in terms of making it less subjective. But again, those algorithms need to be written, which means that there's someone who's deciding how to measure them to begin with. But hopefully over time, we start to kind of incorporate more empirically sound ways of measuring these features. And again, that's kind of the heart of what I'm trying to do right now, is how do we quantify these, and what constitutes biophilic design and what constitutes a lack of biophilic design, and how often are they incorporated, and how does it work when, say, you've got a facade and then you move through that or across that facade, you're walking down the street, and so you're viewing it from different vantage points constantly. You're not necessarily viewing it straight on all the time. So how do we measure it? And how do we measure the way that you move through it? And these are all kind of some of the methodological limitations, which are not insignificant. And I think kind of get to the heart of one of the greatest battlefields of architectural science, which is this meeting of art and science. You know, this idea that architecture is fundamentally kind of a meeting of these two things. And when you're in interdisciplinary research, which I think inevitably with this type of neurophysiological or physiological architectural research, you inevitably are, how do you balance the scientific rigor of neuroscience, or kind of pure science, which is not pure, but it is pure science, and the kind of artistic expression that can be or is architecture in some instances? Because I think on one side, you can get a lot of people in the architecture school who feel as though architectural science can be quite prescriptive, and it can potentially tell them how they should design, which is, I don't believe at all the case. And I kind of always come back to this idea of car design. You know, car design, there's many different kind of safety functions that are required. You know, you have to have a seatbelt, you have to have a certain amount of, you know, kind of vantage, you have to have all of these different features, but there's still an incredible amount of artistry and kind of artistic expression and interpretation that goes into building these things. And I guess that's kind of what we're trying to do right now with architecture. And in the past, we did it with, say, like, you know, tenement housing reforms and some of the really kind of fundamental architectural codes that enforce safety and kind of the prevention of disease and stuff like that. So it's not new in that sense, but trying to kind of pick apart the really subtle variations and their physiological responses, which may seem benign if it's once or twice, you know, these responses are triggered. You know, if you get a physiological stress response from architecture once, maybe not a big deal, but what happens if you get it again and again and again and again and again? And what does that mean over time? So
yeah, I think, speaking as an architect, I don't think the actual, what I would call the programmatic requirements, the actual, like, the building regulations, the need for so and so, like the comparison to like the car safety requirements, I don't think that's the key sticking point. I think because you can sort of lever any kind of architecture around those requirements, and because they're compulsory, like wherever you are, you can make it work. They might be annoying and restrictive, but whatever. I think it's more about the sort of artistic and stylistic side. I think people are of a certain stylistic dogma, without putting it any more strongly than that, resist anything that might challenge that particular dogma.
Fair.
And it's one of the really interesting things to me is, what if you came up with a whole load of sort of algorithmic or programmatic rules that could measure like facade depth or facade complexity or these sorts of things, how easily would it be to comply with those whilst levering in the least popular, ugliest possible architectural style you could.
Yeah.
Because it's amazing to me the ingenuity of architects in creating ugly buildings when they really want to.
Yeah, fair. I mean, there's a lot of ugly cars as well.
Yes, yeah, and it's usually driven by various other reasons like client side and things like that. But it does seem obvious to me, like if you're, as architects, if we're trying to create physiological, psychological responses, and sort of trigger associations in people's brains. That's basically what architecture is you're trying to use the building to obviously fulfill the function of the building, but also create certain feelings in certain places and all this kind of thing around that. Why would you not want a whole load of scientific evidence that says this does this, that does that, here's the evidence of this, here's the correlation between this and this, here's the mechanisms? That seems like incredibly useful to me. So and I think there's more people are realizing that, but I think the biggest barrier to it is that architecture students are effectively art students. Like, I'm sure you know this, like most of them don't even know what a paper is, let alone how to read it or how to interpret it properly.
Well, that's really interesting. And I also think that to an extent that's on researchers, not on them, but it would be helpful for the kind of profession and the incorporation of evidence-based design if researchers, architectural science or architectural health researchers, are able to make their findings more accessible. And it is sort of that difficulty where I think that there's a lot of incredible research that's come out, even, in medical sciences and neuroscience, neuroimmunology. There's a lot of findings there that are very, very applicable to the way we build, but they're not accessible. And they're either behind paywalls and you have to be part of the university to access them, or they're written in a way that is incredibly complex, or they're just really complex ideas that, take years and years of studying to kind of fully comprehend. So trying to find ways to incorporate that, potentially into architectural education, kind of really integrate that into the process of becoming an architect. And then also having specific ways in which science or architectural researchers can communicate with practitioners and help to integrate that research. And my hope really would be to kind of help to design a methodology that allows for testing, communication, redesign, retesting, and creating these kind of feedback loops that are reasonably fast in their turnaround, because once you have the method design, you can turn these around quite quickly. But doing it in a way that's iterative and that allows for kind of improved design and science feedback. But I guess the way to start that would be to take the findings that we have to date and try and make them applicable or accessible. And then eventually we'll get to the stage where we can have this kind of iterative conversation between, architectural researchers and architectural practitioners, because I do feel like there's quite a big, there's a dichotomy between the two of them. They're quite separate. And I really don't think they should be, in the way that I don't think that, pharmacology or kind of pharmaceutical design and medical practitioners should necessarily be working in different fields entirely. They're very interconnected. And so trying to find ways to facilitate that, I think, is pretty key to moving forwards in evidence-based design.
Yeah. I suppose it's difficult to collect the data related to that kind of thing. Like, even if you had, say, post-occupancy evaluation, like, you're not going to get a client to walk around with a sort of a hairnet on, taking their brain images for sort of 6 months after you've finished their house or something like that, are you? Like, it has to be in a controlled setting, like the settings that you've done with VR and then that kind of thing, or however you design it. It can't really be an on-the-ground study, and really practically, unless you know of particular ways of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the hope would be that we have enough evidence that are in controlled environments that do have people who are willing to kind of partake in these more rigorous scientific studies. And from those findings, we can communicate that during the design process. That's ideal. We know generally how things kind of work or how they impact people, and we can kind of intervene at the beginning as opposed to, at the end when it's been built and it's difficult to kind of reconfigure things. But it is tricky. And I would say that it is in its infancy. Really rigorous architectural science is in its infancy, and it's something that we're working on. But as with any field, you got to start somewhere. And I think the more evidence that we acquire, the better. The more data that we acquire, the better. And it's sort of like with, say, I'm not sure, at blood pressure or blood sugar. The reason we know roughly what healthy levels are because we have a tremendous amount of data, and we can conduct, we can figure out what the averages are, what we think is largely healthy. And then it also allows us to identify the outliers, who are people who maybe don't respond to certain environments the same way. I think, designing for, say, dementia care is a really great example of that. Once we know how people experience space largely, we can start to see how various different groups experience space differently, which just allows us to design for them better. It's not kind of trying to create these general design guidelines that are applicable to everybody because everybody's physiology responds the same way to everything. That's not at all the case. That nuance comes, the kind of interpretation and the nuance comes from having the data to begin with. So
yeah, it does seem to me that dementia and healthcare are the sort of gateway to all of this, in that they're sort of because they're sort of scientific fields anyway, and the outcomes are fairly easy to measure or fairly controllable, and the environments are also fairly contained and controllable, whether it's like a dementia care home or a hospital setting or a hospice or anything like that. Like that seems to me like the environment where all this is going to really start, the science will really start coming out properly before it gets applied to other places. Because you've done a bit of research on the healthcare side of all this, haven't you?
In terms of like architectural design and healthcare systems, or certainly kind of literature-based research and trying to understand sort of what different physiological responses to space look like. But my research and my kind of interest more generally would be in preventative care, which is a little bit less sexy than, actually treating people once they're unwell. But because it's sort of this invisible thing that maybe happened or maybe didn't happen, but hopefully it did happen. But this idea that actually if we can intervene before people get sick, that is one of the most efficient and effective forms of healthcare. I also think that architecture offers this incredible opportunity in the sense that, for the most part, its benefits are absorbed passively. It's not like a ride your bike to work scheme where you actually have to ride your bike to work or you have to change your diet. We exist in buildings most of the time for most of us, and the impacts on our physiology happen without us really realizing it, without us consenting to it in many instances. So it also kind of sets in motion this idea of, what are the kind of bioethical standards for architecture as well. As this evidence base builds up, what does that mean? If we know that buildings make us sick or contribute to us getting sick or contribute to negative responses in our body, do architects or built environment professionals have, kind of that same do no harm expectation put on them? Should they? I would say probably. But that's also a pretty heavy topic and something that, requires probably someone much smarter than me to really dig into and kind of unpack. But that is the one thing that comes as we collect this evidence, is that we know more. So what we do with that now. But
yeah, I'd always wonder what percentage of the sort of the mental health crisis can be attributed to architecture. Like if you took the counter point of whether or not 20th century architecture had gone a different way, how much of the change in people's mental health is actually down to their environments they're in. And I suppose it's interesting you related the data of health and well-being relating to, was it architectural facade analysis based on streetscapes? Because obviously that's an amazing sort of correlation to look at, but you've got so many confounding variables in that.
So many.
It must be really difficult to pull that apart.
It is. And I think the big thing is just always trying to articulate the limitations. There is no world in which I'm saying this specific type of architectural form, feature, design, implement, whatever, has resulted in this pathology developing. There's so many things that are kind of that come together in order to elicit that. Even look at like epigenetic expressions. Like there are so many confounding variables. That said, if we can kind of unpack or discover that certain features have some impact, I mean, anything that moves the needles a win in my books, and that's why we've got so many people working on these kind of large scale health issues, because diet has a huge impact and pollution will impact it, and circadian rhythm disruption and our neuroendocrine disruption, our microplastics. There are so many things. And they can only take us so far. It's not as though you necessarily change your diet, but if you're exposed to certain toxic chemicals, it won't fix everything. But if we understand the impact to an extent of each one of them, we can kind of move it forward slowly over time. And I think that there's value in that, like, without a doubt. I mean, I also think that especially in the face of kind of what we're calling like a dementia epidemic, it's terrifying. It's, I think that it's a very scary, it's a devastating condition. And so anything that we can do to help support it, same with mental health, all of these different things, they have such a profound impact on the individual and on their families and on society generally, that anything that we can do to help understand it and help kind of reduce that would be a win. So
yeah,
lots of many variables.
Yeah, well, I think the health and well-being community, if you want to call it that, what industry hasn't quite twigged that environment and environmental psychology and aesthetics are sort of their big missing ingredient at the moment. As you say, like, people focus on diet and they focus on sort of health and mental health and stress and all these sorts of things, which obviously are major factors. But there's also this other chunk of the pie chart that they haven't really embraced yet, which is the environmental psychological side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's happening. I think it's starting. I think it's, I had a really interesting discussion the other day with someone who's in pharmacology, and we're saying, how is it that this hasn't really been explored more before? And there's a bunch of different reasons that we we didn't necessarily have the technological ability to do that. We couldn't prove these neurophysiological changes. It was very difficult to measure. But also, I guess it's sort of a Maslow's hierarchy type deal. We're just trying to figure out which blocks are the biggest and how it all goes, but inevitably they all kind of combine to move towards wellness, or at least reduction in kind of negative health outcomes. But it's a complicated area. I also think that it's difficult because when you're in architecture in and of itself, you don't necessarily have the exposure to ideas around neuroimmunology or kind of neuroscience principles or things like that. And the same goes the other way, where you don't necessarily have, kind of people who are in neuroscience or in neuroimmunology who understand or are interested or have had exposure to architectural kind of theories and principles. So there's also kind of this just logistical thing that comes from being in the middle of them. And that, I think, is with the science side and the neuroimmunology side, there's an expectation to conduct very rigorous science. And that is, without a doubt, critical and can't really be skimped on. You have to do it. And on the architecture side of things, there's a certain skill set. Architects are very good at a lot of different things, but there's this skill set in understanding spatial variables and constructing them and designing environments that could be testable. And so without kind of collaboration between the two of them, it becomes very difficult to test any of it. I think that that's where interdisciplinary design can be really helpful, because you get to exist in the middle. The most critical element of that, I think, is that you just have to stay very, very humble and realize always that there is someone who's a specialist in those respective fields who will know this better than you. I used to work with Alistair Parvin at WikiHouse, and he used to always talk about Donald Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns. You know your known knowns. You know what you know, and then very often you know what you don't know. But you don't always not know what you don't know. And those unknown unknowns are really what get you. And that's where you kind of have to bring in specialists who would know. And that's where really good research comes from, that kind of collaboration and that openness. And just trying to facilitate that as well, even in terms of funding, all of it. There are lots of barriers, but it is happening and it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I think you're right. That's what's missing from most architecture departments, I think, and architecture students, is that humility that, yes, they've got their own agendas and they've got their own styles and their own ways they want to do things, but there's also things you don't know that maybe will input significantly into what you're doing.
Yeah, and it's also just a kind of a beautiful process. I think interdisciplinary collaboration is a very exciting opportunity. It's a way to learn constantly about different things. And I think from a science perspective, you get better science. And I think from a design perspective, you get better designs. And so in that instance, it's a win-win. But
yeah, I think you're right what you said earlier about communication, though. I think it's, as much as I'd love everyone to be able to read papers properly, like if I'm honest, the number of papers I read from start to beginning and actually look at all the diagrams is fairly minimal. So you almost need like a platform within the professional organizations or something that updates constantly as part of their membership and has access to all the latest papers and says, here's a summary of so-and-so paper. It's studied the relationship between X and Y, and here's the outcome.
Yeah, and what does that mean for us? How do we apply those findings? And something that I'm kind of trying to work on right now is this giant database of all of the studies that are kind of coming out, what they're testing, how they're testing it, what the outcomes are, and what that means for future design and how that can be implemented, and trying to kind of categorize them and organize it and put it into words that are comprehensible, that you can understand, that make sense, which is always a struggle. Always a struggle.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Because there's obviously the Journal of Environmental Psychology exists. There's is it the Environmental Based Design, EBD journal? I think that's one that I've
there's
skimmed across.
Journal of Evidence-based design, I believe.
Yeah.
There's also HERD, Health Environments Research Design Journal. There's a lot of really great stuff in the design of environmental research and public health. That's also very, very good. Architectural Science Review. That's the thing. There's also so many Frontiers in Architectural Science. There's so many different journals. It's difficult to keep up with them. I've actually had to turn off my Google Scholar alerts because I find it very overwhelming. But yeah, trying to like stay up to date. I can't even imagine. Like, it's my full-time job just reading these and trying to understand and write about them. I can't imagine that as a practicing architect or kind of a healthcare professional, that you're going to have the ability to go through the time to go through these things and implement them. So I certainly don't think it's any shortcoming on practitioners or on architectural education. It's nobody's fault. Nobody's doing a bad job here. There's just a gap in the market, and the market being kind of the education process and the implementation of architectural findings. And I think that is a gap that needs to be filled. And increasingly, I think it will be. So.
Yeah, well, the obvious place to put it for me is in CBD, in continual professional development, because we get, like, when you're in a practice, you get so-and-so window company comes in and pays for your lunch and gives you an hour talk on how great their windows are and why you should spec them. Like, you almost need it to be included as a compulsory topic within the CPD requirements for architects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think incorporating it into architectural education as well, and giving people kind of the fundamentals, on what is your circadian rhythm, what are kind of, neuroendocrine responses, what is a physiological stress response, so that when these papers do come out and people do communicate that to them during, whichever kind of forum, that they understand. Because unless you've got a lot of time to read, neuroimmunology research, which not a lot of people do, it's a tricky thing to stay caught up on. But I do think that, it's becoming more and more fashionable to talk about architectural health and kind of architectural science. It's definitely kind of coming up, but there's also a lot more open-mindedness. A couple of years ago, I do think you get bounced around departments a little bit, where, in architecture, they'd be like, well, maybe you're public health, or public health be like, well, maybe you're neuroscience. And then, if you want to use some kind of sort of algorithmic analysis, they're like, well, maybe you're computer science. And you kind of, could bounce around departments. But I've certainly found at Cambridge, there's an openness where they're like, go crazy, as long as it's, rigorous, and it's, I guess, rigorous science, and there's a strong foundation for it, and you've got the skill set that you need, and you can develop the skill set that you need in order to do this kind of research, go for it, which is incredible. And I don't necessarily know if that's always been there. So
yeah, it's difficult to, I suppose, to shoehorn it into the current curriculum, because there's so much that undergrads need to learn anyway that they're basically incompetent at and take a long time to learn. It'd be good to fit it more into the masters, the part 2, to get it more part of that curriculum, and have the sort of design exploration focus more around science and the sort of scientific inputs there, I guess. But there's always more to learn. That's the trouble.
Always, but I guess that's the thing as well, that, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or you're an architect, there's always more research. There's always more insights that's coming up constantly. So it's like, how do you continue learn, and how do you, stay open-minded as well? Because I do think that, there can be some sort of, indoctrination is a really strong word, but you do start to kind of, that is education. You learn what's being taught to you, and you kind of start to, you think critically, and you're encouraged to think critically, but inevitably you do kind of absorb through osmosis certain ideas about how things should be done. And those things are changing, especially over the course of, say, like a career, which can be, 40 years, a long time. So,
well, it's difficult when you get a large number of the lecturers coming in are practicing architects with established practices who learnt 40 years ago or 50 years ago what they were taught in architecture, and now are sort of regurgitating what they were taught and been practicing, rather than the sort of, I suppose, the likes of yourself and doing sort of emerging research on things, sort of teaching the undergrads and not indoctrinating them into the particular way that
indoctrinating them into
your way, of course.
That's what I'm doing. Like, we've got to really be careful about indoctrination. But anyways, let me tell you about architectural neuroimmunology. No, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's that balance as well, because those practitioners who've got that experience have something that I certainly don't have. They've got real life experience of designing buildings and putting it into practice. And so what are the reality, what are the practical realities of building something? Because that is something that I don't know, and I've never done it, and I will probably never do it. I may contribute, or I may test it, or I may kind of, pick it apart. And also I do feel like architectural kind of theory, architectural science, it can come across as very critical, because, we are critiquing what is built, not necessarily in a negative way, hopefully in a constructive way, but inevitably there are criticisms that come from it of how we could do things better. So I do really want to try and stay away from this idea that, let me come in and tell you everything you're doing wrong, and come in with some solutions, because the first one is just really defeatist and quite negative, and that's not fun. Really you want to be trying to give people tools in order to build in ways that you think can help, in my opinion, reduce human suffering, which is probably quite a negative take on it. Like, you could also say enhance human flourishing, which would probably be like a nicer way to put it, but both of them. But this idea that, yes, let's pick it apart, let's test it, let's analyze it, let's critique it, and then let's come up with some solutions and some recommendations. And again, like, the constant more research is needed preface on it all, but more research is needed before I feel like we could give any of those recommendations about what, in a really emphatic way, in a way that we're quite confident in. I certainly wouldn't feel confident in giving any, broad brush recommendations as to what good design is, or how to design for, reduced neuroinflammation. Not yet. And you'd also have to have a lot of caveats as to who you're designing for, and you get into that whole kind of confounding variables and complexity. But yeah, it's a balance between trying to discover research. I read a quote this morning, which I'm going to not communicate properly at all, but it's this idea that, scientific discovery is not about finding something entirely new. It's about trying to understand what's there and make connections to other areas, and it's that kind of filling in of the gaps that we're trying to put things together. It's not this whole new way of seeing the world. We're just trying to kind of connect dots, and eventually it'll be kind of, the picture will be developed enough that it's comprehensible.
Well, I think it's like you mentioned, you wouldn't want to come along and give advice to sort of experienced practitioners, but I think it is the core role. One of the core roles of the architect is to translate all of the inputs, including the sort of neuroaesthetic inputs, into a realistic building. At the end of the day, somebody on a building site has to attach one thing to another thing, usually by hand, and it all becomes very, very practical at the end of the day. But you can feed in much higher up the stream a whole load of principles that then result in the kinds of details that you're designing, the kinds of materials you're using, and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and absolutely, architects are incredible at synthesizing information. They're really good at it. It's an incredible skill set that not many people have, but this ability to take in all of these different ideas and turn it into something, it's quite a beautiful process. And so I do think it gives a lot of freedom as well. And it's kind of coming back to that idea that, architectural science isn't meant to be prescriptive. It's descriptive, really. And then you can take that and do with it what you will. So
Well, I'd love to see, like, we get all of the usual consultants, like the transport consultant and the sort of the environmental consultant and the structural engineers and all these lot. I'd love to see a was it consultant architectural neuroaesthetician giving a
you're
report on
like,
a
can
planning
you get more
application.
niche than that?
Like so
Yeah.
and so architectural neuroaesthetician says this building is complies with the aesthetic requirements as defined in so and so algorithm in the design local plan of so and so council.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it even could be more broad brush than that, and it could just be kind of architectural health, or a kind of neuroarchitectural consultant, which is really, I guess, what it is. It's neuroarchitectural research, but then within that umbrella are all of these kind of interconnected subfields. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that would be an incredible development in the profession.
Well, I think as we mentioned earlier, the algorithms that measure the actual sort of the buildings themselves in terms of their whatever variables you want to do, whether it's like facadal complexity or depth or particular forms or patterns or whatever it is, however it is that you end up writing or anyone else ends up writing algorithms based on the information that you get out of the studies, that will then result in almost like a U value for aesthetics. Like, and you'll have a so-and-so must be between 0.6 and 0.9 in this area to comply with our local planning policy or whatever it is. And if you can have those measurements, and whether there's 2 or 3 of them or just one of them, that will be a very easy way to measure, does this building comply or not, if you can define them well enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the aesthetic triad, which is from, I think it's from a paper from Anjan Chatterjee at UPenn and Alex Coburn, who was at Cambridge. And they've got this concept called the aesthetic triad. And if I've miscited that, apologies, but I'm pretty sure that's the paper that it came from. And it's this idea that aesthetics or neuroaesthetics are kind of the combination of, say, like your cultural experience, where you grew up, the kind of country or culture that you grew up in, your personal experience. So say you got in a car accident on a bridge, you'd have a certain physiological response to bridges, presumably. And then there's your physiological response. And that's really kind of derived by this evolutionary biology. And it's not universal to everyone, but there are more universal notions within that, kind of like the blood sugar, blood pressure thing. There will be outliers and kind of people who deviate from the norm. But there's this idea that, what is it? I was working on a paper and it was saying that for a species that reproduces every year, it can take between 4,000 and 18,000 generations for a lasting evolutionary trait to become fully embedded in a population. It's like, that's a really long time, which would suggest that we've not really evolved to live in cities, or we've not evolved within cities in a way that our physiology is not changed, our neurophysiology is not adapted. That's the word I want. It's not adapted to urban living yet. Potentially it will over time, but a lot of our physiological responses are derived from natural environments, which is where we evolved within. And so this idea that actually there is a part of neuroaesthetics that is physiologically based, and that's kind of the world that I like to try and stay in. Again, like I say, there's people who are much smarter who deal with the other ones. There's a lot of complexity there. I try to stay away from it. But the idea that aesthetics as well is this subjective thing, I don't necessarily agree with. I like the kind of idea that beauty is really our reward for participating in evolution. We go back to things that kind of allow us to thrive and to flourish. We incline towards that which facilitates our health and wellness. And so there is sort of a more universal idea. And we see that in kind of, biomorphic or kind of fractalized complexity in our inclinations and a lot of the kind of, asymmetries and the things that we see, these patterns that we kind of can't ignore. They're just too prevalent to be a fluke or a one-off. And so trying to actually make it so that aesthetics isn't kind of conflated with your subjective preference, I think is also a huge movement that's sort of happening. And that's what neuroaesthetics is really facilitating, is this movement away from, I like this, because, your conscious preference may be for that. But neuroaesthetics, in and of itself also considers what your subconscious is inclined towards and physiologically responding to. It's a lot more holistic, which I think is really interesting. And it also kind of takes us away from that kind of, beauty is subjective debate, or, it incorporates it, but it brings in more complexity, I guess. So yeah, you would be able to presumably eventually.
Yeah, I was at a RIBA event on beauty the other week, and the current president of the RIBA said right near the beginning, anyone who says the words beauty is in the eye of the beholder will immediately be thrown out. And I was like, the fact that you're saying that is so encouraging, and I love that they finally admitted, like, no, beauty is not subjective.
Yeah, absolutely. God, whenever I think of that phrase, though, I think about, when I was a teenager or a kid, I went and I bought this T-shirt and it said "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder," and I thought it was very profound and very cool. And it was only later that I realized that it said "Beauty is in the eye of the beer holder." And
now that I could get on board with.
And I've been wearing it for weeks at that point, and I was like, "Oh my god!" But yeah, no. I think that we're kind of understanding the complexity that is aesthetic preference or aesthetic inclination, and it's a very exciting and emerging field, as all of these things are, but particularly is applied to architecture. Yeah.
So since we're on beauty, there's many ways I could phrase this, apart from what are your general thoughts on beauty? But do you think beauty can be defined algorithmically? Not necessarily currently, but is it possible at all to define it algorithmically?
Not to get all academic about it, but I think that we'd have to define what beauty is in this instance.
I shall consult my philosophy books.
Yeah, well, I think it's a thing where, like, if we're talking about our universal conscious preference, is there a universal conscious preference? There are certainly some patterns and trends. We're kind of working on averages. I think, there's kind of the average inclination, and then there are some outliers. I always joke with my supervisor that we need to do a study that tries to understand whether people who wear black turtlenecks go into architecture, or if going into architecture school mean that you wear black turtlenecks. So, like, what is our inclination, and how is it defined? At what point are we measuring it? There are so many things. But if we're kind of defining beauty in the way that I really like to, which is this physiological inclination to kind of evolutionary development, things that we incline towards that which we evolved within, because it facilitates our flourishing. And that would be kind of in the base, in the kind of the heart of a lot of this biophilic design principles, biophilic biomorphism, biomimicry, all of this idea of kind of how we incorporate it, be it organic matter, but also the fractalized forms, the kind of fractalized complexity and implementation of these geometric configurations. That kind of beauty, yes, to an extent. I think that we could certainly derive some insights from that would suggest certain patterns and processes, kind of, pattern language style vibes, kind of understanding that, there are patterns in life, patterns in the world that we kind of respond to and exist within. But a broad brush, everybody in the entire world will find this master architectural form to be aesthetically pleasing in all ways. I think maybe a stretch, though, who knows?
Yeah, there's a great website, I can't remember the name of it, where people rank buildings based on beauty. It's one of those mass vote up, vote down ones. It's got like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of votes, and obviously they're all highly ornamented, mostly landmarks, all the way down from the top. A lot of them, some really not particularly well known though, until I think you get to like number 80 or something, and you finally get to a modernist building. It's something like the Chrysler building or something like that.
That is very interesting. And I think I know the data set. Is it the University of Warwick one?
Could be. I think it's even just a populist website where they're just upvoting and downvoting things.
Yeah, because the one at Warwick basically has all of these architectural facades. It's the one that I was using at Oxford, which is these geospatially located architectural facades that people have voted on. And I think it's like 200,000 images, and there's about 1 million votes, or there was when I was using the data set, as to what is aesthetically pleasing and what is not. And that was the kind of data set that I tried to find the correlation between, if using the machine learning, like what is the integration of biomorphic fractalization in these buildings? How is it incorporated? Looking at things like spatial frequency and the way that we engage with the form. And is there any correlation with improved public health in the areas where those buildings exist? And that was kind of a bit of a spark moment. I was like, oh my God, I think there is.
Yeah. It's so difficult though, isn't it? Because obviously there's the obvious correlation is, oh, well, the nicer buildings that are more ornamented are in richer areas, which for a whole host of other reasons have better health outcomes.
Yeah. And tried to kind of trying to statistically control for as many confounding variables as you possibly can. Statistics being one of the easier ways to do it, though you have to get into all of the kind of nitty gritty of how are they measured, how reliable is the data. But the methodological limitations that are plaguing my life forever. So,
well, being a scientist, that's part of your
that's
fun of your
job,
day to day, isn't it?
It's the job. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that as going back to it again, the algorithmic analysis of facades for me is the key point, because when I'm sitting here doing a so-and-so 3D model using Autodesk Revit or whatever I'm using, if I can have a little number on the side that says your so-and-so aesthetic variable rating, if you can measure it algorithmically, is X, Y, or Z, however that's defined, whether through sort of spatial analysis through algorithms or through AI relating it to other things, like that's sort of the key measure of, okay, this is beautiful enough, or whatever that is. And again, are there ways of getting around that? Could you create an extremely ugly building? I think the obvious example for me of this is the sort of hyper-organicist, the sort of creepy alien kind of architecture, which you would probably fulfill a lot of the same algorithmic criteria that you were set for beautiful buildings, but we have a sort of visceral response to this. Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that even if it was something like, I don't know, fractal D value, that would be great. And the thing is, that is something I've spent kind of some time looking at like back-end data systems design, or kind of how BIM models are put together, and that is something that could be incorporated. I think when we have enough information, that actually you could be designing in real time while calculating, say, the fractalized D value of the building, recognizing that that's not it. That's not the gold standard for the best building in the world. If you have the best, but it is certainly an indicator of more biophilic design, which potentially might be more aesthetic design, or however you want to define it. But I do think that is possible, and I do think that writing programs that plug into BIM models may be one of the best ways for us to incorporate architectural science and architectural health into practice, something that's taught in schools so that there's a kind of an understanding as to why it's important, and then a direct incorporation. Like, that would be my dream, to actually be able to develop kind of a software that is really a plugin for that gives those insights as you're designing in real time.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure that's something you could plug into Grasshopper, into Rhino, or something like that. Definitely.
Definitely.
Yeah, but it's as you say, it takes the research, it takes the people writing the programs. So you need the Global Institute of Architectural Science or something like that to exist.
Yeah, I guess there's the Academy for Architectural Neuroscience, and that's a great start. And that's kind of reasonably new in the grand scheme of kind of architectural institutions, but it's coming. I really believe that this kind of movement towards architectural science, architectural health, evidence-based design is kind of coming into itself. And like I keep saying, the driving force being good science. And trying to conduct as much good science, because I do feel as though that one of the reasons why it's often dismissed is because people say that the science isn't rigorous enough, and that it's not comprehensive enough. This kind of spatial resolution isn't good enough. There's too many confounding variables that aren't controlled for. They may be right, they may be wrong, but over time, I think as it gets better, as the science gets better, as our ability to control for these confounding variables improves, the science will become more and more compelling. It'll be difficult to ignore. So that's the goal, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the other thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is client incentives towards this, which is always the hardest part for me, because everyone thinks, oh, it's going to be super expensive. But if you can take your, say, fractal D value or whatever it is, and then say, okay, we've got this paper or this set of data that relates so-and-so fractal D value to so-and-so increase in employee well-being or occupier well-being or something like that. you can then say, okay, Mr. Client who wants to build a big office building, if you increase your fractal D value by so and so much, your employee well-being value is likely to go up by this much, which will save you that much per year in employee absenteeship or something. And suddenly you've got a financial mechanism that incentivizes better design, or more complex design. Whereas at the moment, they're just going to say, oh, that's more complex, it's going to cost more, I just want my nice big glass curtain wall, and that's simple, and so and so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's kind of two ways. Like you said, there's two ways to go about it. One would be the financial incentive directly from the client, whose workforce is more efficient, who takes less sick days, who all of those things, which is very kind of utilitarian, but potentially the most compelling, or I don't know, the kind of easiest to sell. You can also kind of go through public policy and mandate, which would be the dream, where actually you have to do this. But it also, you think about kind of, public health econometrics, it's really expensive to treat sick people. Not only is there a huge human suffering associated with it, but it's also really expensive. And so this idea that potentially if we could avoid people getting as sick or sick, hopefully totally, that would be ideal. So kind of maybe government regulations would be one really good way to go about that as well. But in terms of kind of client appeal, the other thing is that people do value their health. So would you pay more to live in a building that's been empirically validated as, more healthy or better for your physiological well-being kind of long term? I think people would potentially pay for that. Or if it's kind of a real estate developer, they may get more investment if their building's been tested or has been approved or incorporates certain principles. So there are a couple of different kind of sneaky ways in forcing people to do what I think is the right thing.
Well, we're saying that rating. I'm imagining, the EPC ratings you get for energy. The little thing, I'm imagining one of those for aesthetics. So like your building is so and so rated on the aesthetic.
Health generally, and all of that. And it's, it's not just architectural neuroscience. It is, like you said before, it's, it's lighting and circadian rhythm. It's, the types of materials you use in neuroendocrine dysregulation. It's noise pollution. It's thermal comfort. It's all of these things. It also is architectural form, which I think is kind of least explored, which is why I'm particularly interested in it. What is the geometric configuration? So that is like this kind of not untouched. There are people working on it, but I don't think it's as explored as some of the other areas. But I do think that there's a lot of value. So that would be like a very comprehensive architectural health review of a building. So there are a few ways to kind of go about it. The question is just, where are you? How difficult it is to kind of get people to implement these things, right?
Yeah, we're definitely a long way off. It's good to see the from the sort of the state regulation side. Obviously, we've got the design codes coming up in the UK now, which are starting to come in. And I think a lot of the evidence on this will feed into those quite a lot. Yeah. If you say, maybe not explicitly initially, but later on you might say, okay. Yeah. Is there any part of this subject that I haven't mentioned yet that you think is worth exploring? Any, like, even if it's a tiny little nitty gritty area of like...
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really interesting things is actually like what this means for our physiology. Like what is kind of architectural neuroinflammation or neuroimmunology, and what significance does that have? Like how big an impact could it potentially have, even though we've kind of talked about all of the confounding variables that exist. So it's not necessarily just the built environment that would impact it, but like what does that actually mean for our health and wellness long term, which I think would be kind of one of the interesting elements of, architectural health education. The idea is like what actually happens, what is neuroinflammation? Like it's the inflammation of the brain, we know that, but what does it contribute to? I think that's a particularly interesting area, kind of a technical one, but it's one that's mediated primarily in many ways through physiological stress responses. So this idea that kind of seemingly benign things in architecture, small stressors, may have a much more significant impact than we initially thought. There's this thing called allostatic overloading, which is kind of the process that allows you to return to homeostasis. And so it's kind of how do you maintain your balance. But if you have something that's constantly pushing you out of that balance, usually you've got systems in the body that allow you to return to your homeostatic kind of base. But if you're in an environment that continues to push you out through noise, through pollution, through architectural configuration, what does that mean over time? And that's where you kind of get into the chronic inflammation, like extended chronic stress, chronic inflammation. And that is when it gets really problematic. And I think that the architectural element there is particularly profound in the sense that we spend so much time in buildings. And like we said before, we often spend time in buildings that we didn't necessarily like consent to being in. We have to go to there. You know, we have to go. We've got to go to work. We've got to go walking down the street. We've got to do all of these things. So I think that's a really kind of interesting element to it as well. But
yeah, it reminds me of the phrase 99% invisible, obviously a famous architectural podcast. Yeah, you only really notice these things when they're faulty or when they annoy you. Like good design is 99% invisible. It's sort of around you. But you're right, it's not something you can necessarily notice particularly easily. It's very sort of chronic in that sense, isn't it? That it just chips away at you either positively or negatively, sort of a little bit at a time. And which is obviously what makes it so hard to measure as well.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, it kind of comes back to that. Like I always like that thing that, you know, the art asks question, science finds answers, and design provides solutions. Or that's not the proper quote, but that's kind of the general idea, that actually it is this kind of collaborative process between all of these different disciplines that allows us to go from an inclination or kind of a hypothesis all the way to a design solution. But with regards to architecture, it is kind of trying to pick apart these seemingly benign things that are so subtle that maybe they don't seem like that big a deal. But when you're exposed to them multiple times a day, every day, for your entire life, they are actually quite profound and quite significant. But yeah, it's a complicated process. But
well, like you said, our brains have evolved for a certain environment, and our environment has way overtaken what our brains were evolved for. So it's up to likes of myself as architects or my profession to do what we can to bring back the environment to match our brains more than the other way around, I think.
Yeah, I think that if we wait for our brains or physiology to catch up with the built environment, it would just, it's going to be a long time. So
yeah. So let's wrap this up pretty soon. But what's your current problem that you're working on in your research? Like, what's currently occupying your thoughts and your mental bandwidth?
Yes, so it's kind of what we've been talking about, which is this idea as to how do we quantify architectural form? How do we quantify specific deviations in the built environment? So how do we measure them so that I know when I'm testing physiological responses, I know what I'm testing, and kind of trying to identify these forms. I guess, you know, a lot of the biophilic research and kind of theory would be, you know, defining and kind of pushing a lot of the ideas that I'm working with right now. I mean, I'm really the fractal value and the fractal kind of integration is really at the heart of a lot of it. But everything from, you know, ceiling height to window position to, you know, kind of the sharpness of certain angles, like all of it contributes. But how do we measure it? And then also, how do we measure it in a way that we can measure again in the same way? Like, how do we kind of create this kind of continuity so that there's not this subjective kind of interpretation? But that's the biggest thing, you know, in terms of the physiological responses, we've definitely got some issues. Because it's difficult to measure neuroinflammation. It's not an easy thing to measure. There are some new kind of tools that are coming out that allow us to do it more easily and provide more insight. But it's the architectural side of things. It's kind of, that's a really, you know, it's a very tricky solution, tricky question. But
are you exploring that in 2D or in 3D or in both?
3D primarily.
Okay. What, through models or through?
Yeah, it would be through models. I mean, a lot of like you kind of, it's theory based in many ways, and it's trying to kind of pull in all of the existing literature from environmental psychology, evolutionary biology, stuff like Nico Salongaros, and kind of, you know, the mathematics of architecture, constructal law with Adrian Bijan. A lot of people who have done a lot of really incredible thinking on how space has been configured in the past. And what some of the pattern language again, so, you know, what are some of the patterns or some of the ways in which we've built, and then picking them apart, trying to tie them to specific theories of neurophysiological response and development, and then put together a really tight empirical study to test it. but I do find that one of the hardest things is actually picking the architectural feature to assess, and creating a model that's compelling enough that you feel as though it's a semi-realistic depiction of being in that kind of architectural environment. I think that's where like collaboration with architects specifically is going to be really, really helpful, because you'll have the ability to create very, very beautiful, realistic renders, but that are computationally derived and can be altered quite easily in many instances. But it's really tricky.
I can imagine.
Yeah, keeping me up at night. No, I'm trying to really kind of like figure it out. But what about you? Like, what do you think, in terms of like defining principles, or architectural practices, patterns that we incorporate, either kind of consciously or subconsciously? Like, what do you think are some of the kind of most common architectural features that are incorporated into design that potentially would warrant these stress responses?
Well, I think individual features are sort of less important for me. I think it's more because they're so specific to building typologies and to all those sorts of things that they're also sort of more of a micro level. I think the more what Nikos calls structural order, the sort of ratios between things, the fractal pattern work, the level of different scaling, the depth of things as well. It's so hard to analyze, I think, as well. It's trying to distill that into different principles is very difficult. I think you could measure things at almost different resolutions as well, to use the way that Mark Foster Gage puts it in terms of resolution. Like if you have a sort of a flat glass plate facade at 1 dimension or 2 dimensions, it feels flat, but then it might have little gaps in between, so you go 1 extra resolution down and you've suddenly got an extra way of measuring it.
Frequency, right?
Yeah, it's almost like the way we design buildings. Like when you've got a block model, you'll still start designing things in blocks, and then it'll be slightly more detailed blocks, and then it'll be detailed blocks with extra little elements on, and then suddenly you're getting more and more and more detailed. It's the LOD and LOI in BIM language.
That's a really interesting way of going about it. Maybe actually a really interesting way of defining specific architectural forms or kind of structural orders and testing them is actually to go at it in that kind of level, where you're using blocks and then you're making it slightly more granular and you're looking slightly more granular. And at what point do you start to see changes? And then you try a different configuration and you do the same thing. And it's almost just like peeling back. Because it also gives you like a blank facade, right, to begin with, where it's, a neutral test, like a neutral test. So you've got like a neurological state that is not colored by any visual exposure to a form.
Yeah,
so
well,
that's very interesting way.
Yeah, that sort of continuity is hard because obviously you take a picture of one building and you can't make it exactly the same as another building. That you've got to make sure that the lighting's the same, the environment's the same, the angle's the same, all this kind of thing to sort of make them equal. It'd be great to relate the do you know the SketchUp library of all the various buildings that people have spent vast amounts of time designing? If you cross-relate the data set of that, of, I don't know, complexity analyzed algorithmically somehow with 2D photographs of those buildings, and see what the correlation is. Yeah,
well, and there's some really great research that's kind of come up that's tried to understand what the relationship between 2D and 3D representations of similar things are. And it's always interesting to me that they're reasonably compelling. The findings from the 2D are decent replications. I guess it's kind of the same with VR, combining or comparing a VR environment, a VR architectural environment with the actual built building. And that's one of the really cool things is if you get to work with a client through the whole process. So like, let's test the building in VR. Let's test the renders. Let's test the 2D. Let's test the 3D. Let's test the VR render. And then let's test the actual building the second year, experiencing it for the first time. Okay, what about a week later? What about a month later? What about 5 years later? Like, what are the changes in kind of doing these kind of longitudinal studies? Again, confounding variables being the bane of my existence, but also part of the job. But that is a really interesting way of kind of going about it.
You just need the data set, don't you? Like with you
need a really good data set. You need a really good data set that has a strong theory uniting or kind of unifying all of the changes and describing why. Not necessarily why you respond to those changes, that can be done later in the discussion where you draw from different theories, but you need a very robust data set that describes and defines all of the different changes between the buildings.
Yeah, that's tricky to get. I've always wanted BIM models to be compulsory for planning applications. And then you'd get
I think
everyone
they
would be
would
submitting
soon,
them.
but
Well, we'll
you
be
think
lucky.
no?
It's considering you can get away with a sort of pencil drawing on the back of a napkin for a planning application in this country. I'm not sure how likely it is to compel BIM models that soon, as much as I'd love to see it.
Yeah, fair enough. Eternal optimist,
Yeah.
but it would be helpful, and also, you know, it would be kind of like that neuroaesthetic study in the sense that we know kind of on average how far people travel, more or less. I mean, it's you know, again, averages, but we'd be able to kind of see what buildings are you experiencing on a daily basis, because, you know, it's not as though people just spend their days in their house or just spend their days in their office. Like, what's your walk to work, kind of space syntax lab kind of vibe, you know, what are your patterns, where are you kind of moving through space, what are you seeing on a daily basis or quite frequently, because that's a big part of it as well, you know.
Well, you've got the two user bases, haven't you? You've got the members of the public who are subjected to the facades of the buildings they pass, or the public buildings they enter. But then you've got the user base of the actual in the buildings themselves, whether that's the public in public buildings or private individuals in private buildings. And it's sort of, I guess it's a very different kind of analysis if you're in those sorts of spaces.
Definitely. I mean, I'm much more interested personally in facades, because there is that kind of forced movement or forced exposure. Force seems very aggressive, but, you know, it's kind of that kind of unintentional exposure where people are they just happen to be there or happen to be moving through there. So I find facades particularly interesting. But again, there's all of these issues with exposure time. Like, how long do you actually have to be exposed to a building for it to have a profound impact on your physiology? You know, are these exposures, is 5 seconds enough? Does it have to be 5 minutes? Do you have to spend 5 hours looking at the building for there to be a meaningful change? And so trying to understand exactly what that looks like. I don't know, maybe it's, you know, like GoPros on someone, having people record. Like, I'm not sure what the study exactly will be, but I do think that would be a very interesting kind of issue to unpack.
Yeah, I tell you what comes to mind as what could be a good data set is students at different universities, because obviously there are very particular architectural aesthetics in, like, the red brick universities in this country. You've got city universities like Oxbridge, Bath, Durham, those sorts of ones. You've got the campus universities like Kent, who have got like plate glass and brutalism most of the time. So that could be a good data set, I suppose, and sort of analysing their experiences, because they spend their whole lives, or for the time they're there, or most of their lives, in those environments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's so many interesting kind of avenues to take with it too, which is exciting for other people who are potentially interested in, to all of those out there who are interested in architectural science or kind of architectural physiology. There's a lot to study, but yeah, that would be a really interesting one. I think also the kind of the contained nature of the campus is helpful in that respect, you know.
Yeah, it's difficult because you want big data sets that you can cross-relate, can't you? That's to get just weed out the confounding variables.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, and it's also one of the things where, and this is something that I always have to kind of remind myself, and I have various different people who always try to remind me, you're like, okay, walk before you can run. You know, I'd love to do this 3D interpretation of a city of you moving through space. You're like, well, in reality, it will probably be trying to understand the neurophysiological responses to one specific type of architectural facade compared to one other. And you're like, okay, that we can do. And then it will very, very likely be proven wrong at some point, which is how this scientific exploration works, where you're just waiting for someone to prove you wrong, which is a good thing, which means there's progress happening. And then you do it again, and then you do it again, and it gets a bit better and a bit better and a bit better. And then over time, hopefully we've got something that's, you know, quite profound and potentially very helpful. But yeah.
Well, that's where your humility and your lack of ego has to come in and be like, yes, it's a good thing that someone disproved all of my research.
Yeah,
hooray.
exactly. You're like, yay, I'm wrong. Cool. Yeah, you have to you've got to have a thick skin, I think, for those ones, but part of the process, I guess. But it is. So,
is there anything architects or architecture students you think could do more to engage with all of the sort of neuroaesthetics and all this stuff on a day-to-day basis?
yeah, I do. I mean, I think that just having a general curiosity about it is huge, and just kind of trying to stay open-minded. Again, it's that issue of kind of moving information out into the world. So you kind of do have to have that very kind of active curiosity of trying to be like, well, what would this mean for the people? And what would this mean, not just kind of, you said architecture students are very often kind of art students, looking beyond kind of the artistic expression of it and being like, okay, actually, what would the practical realities be? And how would that make people feel, but not just kind of an emotional way, though that's important too. But I guess it's sort of just having an appetite for it, and being open-minded to it. I do definitely get met in some instances with a fair bit of kind of dismissiveness and aggression, which is to be expected on both sides. I mean, there are lots of, flaws and gaps and all of those things. And I think it's part of the process, and it's important to be challenged. So I welcome it. But also kind of keeping an open mind and being like, okay, well, what actually would that mean? And how could we potentially use our studies like actually being in school and the projects we use in school to kind of help move this evidence base forward. But I guess just really being kind of open to it would be the biggest thing, be open to more complexity, be open to these ideas that are kind of coming out. But again, I think it needs to be met halfway, that we've got to make it accessible too. So.
Yeah, and don't get caught in architectural dogmas is what I'd say. Of any kind, from any direction.
Yeah, absolutely, including anyone that, potentially, I was going to say that I might advocate for. And I was like, no, but we don't advocate for them. We're just trying to test them and prove them and take it as you will. But yeah, try and stay away to the best of your abilities, kind of keep an open mind.
Yeah, keep an open mind and keep a scientific mind as well.
Yeah, intellectual curiosity is key, with all things. And then also, yeah, I can always come back to it because I think it's a really, really important element. And that's also just kind of stay humble, and then kind of accept that we can't know everything. Nobody can. There is this inevitable kind of transfer of knowledge that happens when we collaborate. And this idea that, we can't do it all by ourselves. And that's sort of the beauty of the creative process, of the scientific process, scientific discovery. It's this kind of collaborative nature. And that is so important. And I can't emphasize that enough. There's always someone who's going to be better than you at something, and you're going to be better than other people at something too. We've all kind of got our niche. So I think that's a pretty key point as well for everybody, myself included.
Yeah. Read philosophy as well as science, I'd say.
Yeah, it's the intersection, right? You can't get too deep in any of them. It's spoken like a true interdisciplinary.
Says the person who's doing a PhD.
Spoken like someone who's not that good at anything. Someone who's not really that great at anything. You can't be good at everything.
Yeah, don't get too deep into something, says the person doing a PhD in something extremely specific.
Yeah, like the most niche thing ever. So, I'll eat my words, but...
Yeah, I'm sure. Brilliant. All right, well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Cleo. And we look forward to seeing the outcome of all of your research.
Oh, thanks. I'm looking forward to see the incorporation of the findings in your design practice as we go.
We'll do our best.